When wealthy businessman Thaddeus Mercer's expensive car breaks down during a terrible storm, he has no choice but to seek help at a nearby cottage. The old woman who lives there, Esther Caldwell, surprises him by knowing exactly how to fix his complicated car. But as she works on the engine, Thaddeus notices a strange ring on her finger, one that looks exactly like his late father's special ring that disappeared years ago. How does this mysterious woman have his father's ring? And what secrets about his family's fortune is she hiding that could change everything Thaddeus thought he knew about his life? Rain pounded against the sleek midnight blue Aston Martin as Thaddeus Mercer gripped the steering wheel tighter. This wasn't how his day was supposed to go. The winding country roads of Millbrook were turning into muddy streams, and his GPS had given up 20 minutes ago, the screen flickering before going dark completely. "Come on," Thaddeus muttered, squinting through the windshield. The wipers fought a losing battle against the downpour. He was supposed to be at an important meeting in 2 hours, not lost in the middle of nowhere. The car sputtered once, twice, then a warning light flashed red on the dashboard. Before Thaddeus could react, the engine died with a whine that faded into silence. Only the sound of rain remained. "No! No! No!" He slammed his palm against the steering wheel. The custom-made vehicle had cost more than most people's houses, and now it sat useless on this deserted road. He pulled out his phone. No signal. Of course. Thaddeus ran his fingers through his dark hair, now sprinkled with silver at the temples. At 42, he had built Zenith Innovations from a promising startup into a tech empire worth billions. He solved impossible problems every day. A broken-down car shouldn't defeat him. He pressed the start button again. Nothing happened. The rain seemed to laugh at him, drumming harder on the roof. Through the foggy window, Thaddeus spotted a light. In the distance, a small cottage with smoke rising from its chimney. Someone was home. He sighed, looking down at his Italian leather shoes and cashmere coat. There was no way to stay dry, but he had no choice. Stepping out into the storm, the cold rain instantly soaked through his expensive clothes. Mud splashed onto his pants as he trudged toward the cottage, each step making a squelching sound. This was exactly why he avoided the countryside. The cottage looked like something from a fairy tale. Stone walls covered with ivy, a thatched roof, and a small garden that would probably be charming if it weren't drowning under the current deluge. As Thaddeus approached, he noticed an old woman in a yellow raincoat kneeling in the garden, apparently unbothered by the weather as she covered some plants with plastic sheeting. "Excuse me," Thaddeus called over the rain. "I need help." The woman looked up, her face partially hidden under her raincoat hood. She appeared to be in her late 70s, with deep wrinkles that spoke of years spent outdoors. She stood with surprising ease for someone her age. "Car trouble?" she asked, her voice clearer and stronger than Thaddeus expected. "Yes, it just died down the road." He gestured vaguely behind him. "I need to call for a tow truck, but I don't have any phone service." The woman nodded, seemingly unsurprised. "The storm knocks out the cell towers around here. Happens every time." She secured the last plastic sheet over her plants and straightened up. "I'm Esther Caldwell. You'd better come inside before you catch your death." Without waiting for a response, Esther turned and walked toward the cottage door. Thaddeus hesitated, only briefly, before following her. What choice did he have? Inside, the cottage was warm and surprisingly bright. A fire crackled in a stone fireplace, and bookshelves lined the walls. The space was small but cozy, filled with comfortable-looking furniture that had clearly seen better days. A fluffy orange cat lounged on an armchair, opening one eye to examine the visitor before going back to sleep. "That's Whiskers," Esther said, removing her raincoat and hanging it on a hook by the door. "He doesn't like strangers much, but he won't bother you." Thaddeus stood awkwardly in the entryway, water dripping from his clothes onto the worn wooden floor. "I'm Thaddeus Mercer. Thanks for letting me in. If I could just use your phone—" "Landline's out too," Esther replied matter-of-factly. "Storm's a bad one. Here, let me get you a towel and something dry to wear. My late husband was about your height, though not quite as broad in the shoulders." Before Thaddeus could protest, Esther disappeared into another room. He took the opportunity to look around. The cottage was neat and organized, but what caught his attention were the bookshelves. Instead of novels or cookbooks, they held textbooks on electrical engineering, physics, and automotive mechanics. Definitely not what he expected in an elderly woman's country home. Esther returned with a towel and folded clothes. "Bathroom's through there," she said, pointing to a door. "Change into these. I'll make some tea." 10 minutes later, Thaddeus emerged feeling slightly ridiculous in an old flannel shirt and pants that were a bit too short. Still, they were warm and dry. Esther was in the small kitchen area, pouring hot water into a teapot. "Feel better?" she asked, without turning around. "Yes, thank you," Thaddeus replied. "Is there any way to get a tow truck out here? I really need to get back to the city." Esther placed the teapot and 2 mugs on a tray. "Not in this weather, I'm afraid. The roads to town will be flooded by now." She carried the tray to a small table. "But I might be able to help with your car." "What happened before it stopped?" Thaddeus frowned. "With all due respect, Mrs. Caldwell, it's an Aston Martin with custom modifications. It needs a specialist mechanic." Esther smiled, her eyes twinkling with something that looked almost like amusement. "With all due respect, Mr. Mercer, I've fixed more vehicles than you've probably owned. Tell me what happened." There was something in her confident tone that made Thaddeus reconsider. The engine made an unusual noise, then all the electrical systems went haywire, and it just died. Esther nodded thoughtfully. "Sounds like the alternator might have failed, or there could be a problem with the electrical routing system." She sipped her tea. "When the rain eases up, we can take a look." "We?" Thaddeus couldn't keep the skepticism from his voice. "Unless you'd prefer to wait days for a tow truck and specialist mechanic," Esther replied calmly. Thaddeus studied the old woman more carefully. There was something oddly familiar about her, though he was certain they'd never met. She held his gaze steadily, and for a brief moment he had the unsettling feeling that she was assessing him just as carefully. "I guess we can take a look," he finally agreed. "Good." Esther stood up. "The rain's letting up a bit now. Let's go see what's wrong with your fancy car." As they walked back out into the drizzle, Thaddeus couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Esther Caldwell than met the eye. She moved with purpose toward his car, her steps surprisingly spry for someone her age. When they reached the Aston Martin, she asked him to pop the hood. Without hesitation, Esther leaned over the complex engine, her eyes scanning the components with practiced ease. It was at that moment, as she reached in to check a connection, that Thaddeus noticed the ring on her left hand. It was unlike anything he'd ever seen. Platinum, with an intricate geometric pattern that seemed to catch what little light there was, creating an almost hypnotic effect. And suddenly, Thaddeus froze. He had seen that ring before. But where? An old memory tickled the edge of his mind, just out of reach. As he stared at the ring, Esther's hands continued to move expertly through his engine, and the strange feeling that they were somehow connected grew stronger. The rain began to fall, harder again, but Thaddeus barely noticed. Something about that ring had changed everything. "Mr. Mercer?" Esther's voice broke through Thaddeus's trance. "I need you to hold this flashlight for me." Thaddeus blinked, pulling his attention away from the ring to take the small metal flashlight she offered. The rain drummed against his back as he directed the beam where she pointed. "I was right," Esther said, her hands moving with surprising dexterity among the complex array of wires and metal. "It's the auxiliary electrical routing system. These custom luxury vehicles often have a redundant circuit that malfunctions in heavy moisture." She pointed to a small black box nestled deep within the engine. "That's your problem right there." Thaddeus frowned, leaning closer. "That's impossible. My mechanic in the city, Gustav, said that component was completely waterproof." Esther let out a small, knowing laugh. "Nothing is completely waterproof given enough time and pressure. Besides, this isn't the original part, is it? Someone's modified it." "How could you possibly know that?" Thaddeus asked, genuinely surprised. "The soldering pattern." She pointed to tiny silver lines barely visible in the flashlight beam. "That's handwork, not factory precision. Someone customized this. Tried to make it more powerful, I'd guess, but compromised the waterproofing in the process." Thaddeus stared at her, momentarily forgetting the ring. She was right. He'd had the car's electrical system enhanced last month to accommodate a new sound system that required more power than the standard configuration could handle. "Hold the light steady," Esther instructed as she straightened up. "I need to get my toolbox." She disappeared into the rain, heading toward a small wooden shed behind the cottage. Thaddeus remained by the car, confusion washing over him in waves stronger than the storm. How did this elderly woman in the middle of nowhere know so much about custom automotive electrical systems? And that ring, why did it seem so familiar? Esther returned carrying an old, rust-spotted metal toolbox. She set it down and opened it, revealing a collection of precision tools that looked both well-used and meticulously maintained. "This should do the trick," she said, selecting a small screwdriver and a pair of needle-nose pliers. "It's a simple, bypass repair. It won't be permanent, but it'll get you back to the city." She began working, her weathered hands moving with the confidence of decades of experience. As she reached deeper into the engine, her sleeve pulled back, revealing a faded scar that ran along her forearm. The kind of mark left by an electrical burn. "You were an engineer," Thaddeus said suddenly, the realization hitting him. Esther's hands paused briefly before continuing their work. "What makes you say that?" "The books in your cottage, that scar on your arm, the way you understand this system." He gestured toward the engine. "This isn't just hobby knowledge." Esther didn't look up, but a small smile played at the corner of her mouth. "I've had many jobs in my life, Mr. Mercer." "Thaddeus," he corrected automatically. "Thaddeus," she repeated, the name sounding strangely significant on her lips. "Could you hand me that electrical tape?" He passed her the tape, and as he did, his eyes caught the ring again. The intricate pattern seemed to shimmer despite the gray, stormy light. Concentric hexagons surrounding what looked like a stylized lightning bolt. It triggered something in his memory, something from his childhood, perhaps. "That's an unusual ring," he commented, trying to sound casual. "I've never seen anything like it." Esther's hand twitched slightly, and she quickly tucked it away, using her right hand instead to wrap the tape around a connection. "It's just an old family piece," she said, her tone suddenly guarded. "Nothing special." But the way she pulled her hand back told Thaddeus it was anything but ordinary. He wanted to press further, but she had already moved on, her focus entirely on the repair job. "Almost done," she said. "Just need to reroute the auxiliary power through the secondary." "Conduit," That should bypass the damaged component entirely, Thaddeus found himself saying, following her logic. But won't that reduce the available power for the entertainment system? Esther glanced up at him, her eyes sharp with intelligence. Yes, but better to have a working car with a basic sound system than a fancy paperweight with surround sound, wouldn't you say? Thaddeus couldn't help but laugh. Fair point. For the next 20 minutes, they worked in surprisingly comfortable silence, with Esther occasionally asking him to hold something or adjust the light. The rain continued to fall, but less violently now, settling into a steady drizzle that seemed determined to last the day. Finally, Esther stepped back. That should do it. Try starting it now. Thaddeus slid into the driver's seat, pressed the ignition button, and felt a surge of relief as the engine hummed to life. The dashboard lit up, though several warning lights remained on. Ignore those. Warnings, Esther called through the open door. They're just confused by the bypass. The car will run fine until you can get it properly repaired. Thaddeus got out, looking at her with newfound respect. You just saved me hours, possibly days, of hassle. I don't know how to thank you. No need, she replied, closing her toolbox. But we should get back inside. This rain isn't finished with us yet, and neither is that engine. We need to let it run for about 30 minutes to make sure the repair holds before you take off. If to emphasize her point, the sky darkened ominously, and the rain began to intensify again. Thunder rumbled in the distance. I think you're right, Thaddeus agreed, looking up at the threatening clouds. It seems like this storm is just getting started. Little did he know how prophetic those words would prove to be, both for the weather and for the mystery that was slowly unfolding with every glance at the curious ring on Esther Caldwell's finger. The downpour turned violent as they raced back to the cottage, sheets of rain reducing visibility to mere feet. By the time they reached the door, they were both soaked despite the short distance. Whiskers greeted them with a disapproving meow, clearly unimpressed by their dripping state. Looks like the roads will be flooded soon, Esther said, peering through the window at the increasingly treacherous conditions. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the landscape before thunder cracked overhead. You won't be going anywhere tonight, I'm afraid. Thaddeus checked his phone again. Still, no signal. I need to let my team know I won't make the meeting. He couldn't remember the last time he'd missed an executive session. Phone lines might come back once the storm moves east, Esther offered, handing him a fresh towel. In the meantime, you're welcome to stay for dinner. I was making beef stew. Anyway, plenty for two. Thaddeus accepted the towel with a grateful nod. His clothes from earlier were still damp, so he remained in the borrowed flannel and pants. As Esther moved to the kitchen area, Thaddeus took the opportunity to examine the cottage more thoroughly. The main room was cozy, but surprisingly well organized. One entire wall was dedicated to bookshelves filled with technical manuals, engineering, journals, and science texts spanning decades. What caught his attention most, however, were the peculiar gaps between books, spaces where it appeared items had been hastily removed, as if Esther had cleared away certain volumes before allowing him inside. On the opposite wall hung several framed photographs. Thaddeus moved closer to examine them. Most showed landscapes or the cottage in different seasons, but there were surprisingly few personal photos. As he approached one showing a younger Esther standing beside a large piece of machinery, she suddenly appeared at his elbow with 2 mugs of coffee. "Cream or sugar?" she asked, smoothly positioning herself between Thaddeus and the photographs. "Black is fine," he replied, accepting the mug and noting how deliberately she guided him toward the sitting area away from the photos. Curiouser and curiouser. They settled into chairs by the fireplace, where Esther stoked the flames to combat the growing chill. Outside, the storm unleashed its full fury, rain lashing against the windows while the wind howled through the trees. "So, Thaddeus Mercer," Esther said, sipping her coffee, "CEO of Zenith Innovations. You're quite the celebrity in the tech world." Thaddeus raised an eyebrow. "You know who I am?" "I may live in the countryside, but I do read the news," she replied with a small smile. "Your company's work in renewable energy storage has been interesting." There was something in her tone, not quite criticism, but definitely assessment, that made Thaddeus sit up straighter. "We've made significant breakthroughs in battery technology," he said, feeling, oddly, like he was defending his thesis rather than making small talk. "Our new grid-scale storage systems could revolutionize how clean energy is distributed." Esther responded noncommittally. "And what about the efficiency problem? The current lithium matrix configuration loses nearly 40% of its charge in cold weather applications." Thaddeus nearly choked on his coffee. That information wasn't public. It was a problem his research team had been struggling with for months. "How could you possibly know that?" Esther's eyes twinkled. "Just an educated guess. Physics doesn't change, even if technology does." She rose to check on the stew bubbling on the stove. Similar problems plagued early battery designs decades ago. Thaddeus followed her to the kitchen area, his curiosity now fully ignited. "You're not just an engineer. You specialized in energy storage systems, didn't you?" She stirred the stew, her left hand, the one with the ring, gripping the ladle. Among other things, it was a different era. Women in engineering had to be versatile. She tasted the stew, then added a pinch of salt. "Tell me about your company. How did you build it?" The conversation shifted as they prepared dinner together, with Thaddeus explaining how he had expanded the company his father had started into the technology giant it was today. He found himself sharing details he rarely discussed: the challenges of the early days, his recent divorce from Caroline after 15 years of marriage, the pressure of constantly innovating in a competitive field. "The hardest part is staying true to our mission," he admitted as they sat down to eat. "My father founded the company on the principle that technology should solve humanity's biggest problems, not just make profits. Sometimes shareholders don't see it that way." "And what would Maxwell think of the company now?" Esther asked casually, passing him a basket of bread. Thaddeus froze, the bread halfway to his plate. "I never mentioned my father's name was Maxwell." A look flashed across Esther's face, so brief he almost missed it. "Regret, perhaps?" She recovered quickly. "It must have been in one of the articles I read. Your father was quite well known in his day." Before Thaddeus could press further, a particularly violent thunderclap shook the cottage, and the lights flickered before going out completely. They sat in sudden darkness, broken only by the glow from the fireplace. "Power outages are common here," Esther said, her voice calm in the darkness. "I have lanterns ready." She moved with surprising confidence through the darkened room, retrieving and lighting oil lamps that cast a warm, golden glow throughout the space. The storm seemed to intensify outside, rain drumming against the roof like thousands of impatient fingers. "Looks like you're definitely staying the night," Esther observed, placing a lantern on the table between them. In the flickering light, her face seemed younger somehow, the shadows softening the lines of age and bringing forth a glimpse of the woman she had once been. "I have imposed enough already," Thaddeus protested weakly. "Nonsense. The guest room is always ready, and you can't drive in this." She gestured toward the window, where water now streamed down the glass in continuous sheets. "Besides, it's nice to have company for a change. Most days, it's just me and Whiskers." "What about family?" Thaddeus asked, watching her carefully. Children? Grandchildren? Something shadowed her expression. No children, she said softly. Just wasn't in the cards. She began collecting their empty bowls, the ring catching the lamplight as she moved. The geometric pattern seemed to come alive in the flame's glow, and once again, Thaddeus felt that nagging sense of recognition. "And your husband?" he pressed gently. "You mentioned he passed away?" "George died 20 years ago," she replied, her back to him as she washed the dishes in a basin of water she'd heated earlier. Heart attack. Very sudden. Her voice was steady, but Thaddeus noticed she twisted the ring on her finger as she spoke. A nervous habit, perhaps, or something more. Either way, he was increasingly certain that Esther Caldwell was not the simple country widow she presented herself to be. As lightning illuminated the cottage in brief, electric flashes, Thaddeus resolved to uncover exactly who this woman was, and why the ring she wore seemed to be calling to him across the gulf of forgotten memories. "The guest room is through here," Esther said, lifting a lantern to guide the way. She led Thaddeus down a narrow hallway, lined with more bookshelves. "Bathrooms across the hall. There's extra blankets in the chest if you get cold." The guest room was small but comfortable, with a handmade quilt covering the bed, and curtains that matched the ones in the main room. A bedside table held another, oil lamp and a stack of books. "More technical manuals," Thaddeus noted. "Thank you for your hospitality," he said, genuinely grateful despite his suspicions. "I don't know what I would have done if I'd been stuck out there." Esther nodded. "Get some rest. Storm might be clear by morning." She handed him the lantern and turned to go. "Esther," Thaddeus said suddenly, "have we met before? There's something familiar about you." She paused in the doorway, her back to him. For a moment, she seemed to consider her answer carefully. "No, Thaddeus, we haven't met." Without another word, she continued down the hall, the sound of her footsteps fading into the storm's rumble. Thaddeus sat on the edge of the bed, unconvinced. Something wasn't adding up. She knew too much about his company, about his father. And that ring, it continued to tug at his memory like a splinter he couldn't quite reach. Sleep proved elusive. After an hour of tossing in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the storm rage outside, Thaddeus gave up. He lit the lamp and decided to explore the cottage. Perhaps he'd find some answers while Esther slept. He crept down the hallway, past Esther's closed bedroom door. The main room was empty except for Whiskers, who watched him with suspicious yellow eyes from his perch on the armchair. The power was still out, and the fire had died down to glowing embers that cast long shadows across the room. Thaddeus approached the wall of photographs he'd been steered away from earlier. In the lantern light, he examined each one carefully. Most were innocuous. Landscapes, the cottage in different seasons, Whiskers as a kitten. But one photo, partially hidden behind others, caught his attention. It showed a young Esther, perhaps in her 30s, standing proudly beside a piece of equipment that looked like an early prototype of a battery system. She wore a lab coat with a logo that had been deliberately scratched out of the photograph. Beside her stood a man whose face had been carefully cut from the picture, leaving only a suited arm around Esther's shoulders. Curiouser still, Thaddeus continued his quiet exploration, careful not to disturb anything. Behind a row of engineering textbooks, he discovered a framed degree that had been turned to face the wall. Gently, he lifted it out and held it to the light. The degree was from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, awarded to Esther Marie Caldwell in 1965 for a doctorate in electrical engineering and energy systems. Thaddeus let out a low whistle. A female engineering PhD in the 1960s would have been exceptionally rare. As he returned the frame to its hidden position, he noticed a small door at the far end of the room, partially concealed by a bookshelf. It was ajar, revealing darkness beyond. Curious, Thaddeus approached it, lamp held high. The door led to what appeared to be a workshop addition to the cottage. He hesitated at the threshold. This was clearly private space, but his need for answers outweighed his better judgment. Slowly, he entered. The workshop took his breath away. One entire wall was covered with blueprints and technical drawings, yellowed with age but meticulously preserved. Workbenches lined the other walls, holding tools, electronic components, and what appeared to be half-finished projects. At the center of the room stood a large drafting table. Spread across it were designs for an energy storage system that looked remarkably similar to what his company's research division was currently developing. Except these designs were dated 1974. Impossible, Thaddeus whispered, leaning closer. The specifications showed solutions to problems his engineers were still struggling with. If these designs were authentic, they were decades ahead of their time. A faded photograph pinned to one corner of the drafting table caught his eye. It showed a group of men in lab coats standing around a prototype. In the center stood Esther, the only woman, pointing to something on the device. And beside her, Thaddeus's heart nearly stopped, was his father, Maxwell Mercer, looking young and confident, his arm around Esther's waist in a gesture that suggested far more than professional collaboration. And there, on Maxwell's hand, was a ring identical to the one Esther now wore. "I see you found my workshop." Thaddeus jumped, nearly dropping the lamp. Esther stood in the doorway, wearing a faded robe, her silver hair loose around her shoulders. Her expression wasn't angry, as he'd expected, but resigned, as if she'd been waiting for this moment. "I'm sorry," Thaddeus stammered. "I couldn't sleep, and I was just looking for answers," she finished for him. "I understand curiosity, Thaddeus. It's the hallmark of a good engineer." She moved into the room, her eyes drifting to the photograph he'd been examining. "Though some might call it trespassing." "You knew my father," Thaddeus said, not a question, but a statement. Esther nodded slowly. "Yes, a long time ago. You worked together." Another statement. "We did more than work together." Her voice was quiet, but steady. She reached out and gently turned the photograph face down. "But that was another lifetime." Thaddeus gestured to the blueprints on the table. "These designs, they're revolutionary, even by today's standards. Why aren't they being used? Why isn't your name known in the industry?" A sad smile touched Esther's lips. "Not all innovations see the light of day, Thaddeus. Sometimes they're buried for reasons that have nothing to do with their merit. My company, Zenith, our new energy storage project looks almost identical to this." He tapped the blueprint. "It can't be coincidence." "No," she agreed. "Not coincidence." Thunder rumbled outside, softer now as the storm began to move away. In the flickering lamplight, Esther suddenly looked tired, the weight of years and secrets evident in the slump of her shoulders. "I think we both need some rest," she said. "Morning will come soon enough, and the roads should be clear for you to leave." "I'm not leaving until I understand what's going on here," Thaddeus insisted. "How do you have these designs? What was your relationship with my father? And that ring," he pointed to her hand. "Why do you wear the same ring he had in that photo?" Esther's hand closed reflexively, hiding the ring from view. "Some questions are better left for daylight, when minds are clearer." She turned toward the door. "Please respect my privacy now, Thaddeus. This room contains memories that are difficult for me. Her tone made it clear the discussion was over, at least for tonight. Reluctantly, Thaddeus followed her out of the workshop, his mind racing with questions and half-formed theories. "Good night, Thaddeus," Esther said when they reached the hallway, her voice gentler now. "Try to get some sleep." As she disappeared into her room, Thaddeus stood in the darkened hallway, the lantern casting strange shadows on the walls. The storm was passing, but he had the distinct feeling that another kind of storm was just beginning, one that had been brewing for decades, waiting for this moment when past and present would collide. The ring, the blueprints, his father's presence in that old photograph, they were pieces of a puzzle he couldn't yet assemble. But one thing was certain. Esther Caldwell held secrets that were intimately connected to his family and his company's future. And somehow, Thaddeus knew that discovering those secrets would change everything he thought he knew about his life. With that troubling thought, he returned to the guest room, though sleep would prove elusive for the remainder of the night. Dawn arrived with gentle persistence, pale light filtering through the curtains of the guest room. Thaddeus had finally fallen into a restless sleep just before sunrise, his dreams filled with geometric rings and familiar strangers. The smell of coffee and bacon roused him, and for a moment he was disoriented, forgetting where he was. Reality flooded back as he sat up. The storm had passed, leaving an eerie quiet behind. He quickly dressed in yesterday's now dry clothes and made his way to the kitchen, where Esther stood at the stove, her back to him. "I checked your car this morning," she said without turning around. "The repair is holding well. You should be able to make it back to the city without any problems." Her tone was casual, as if their midnight encounter in the workshop had never happened. She wore a simple blue dress, her silver hair neatly pinned up, and on her finger, the ring gleamed in the morning sunlight streaming through the window. "Thank you," Thaddeus replied, accepting the mug of coffee she offered. "But I think we have some things to discuss before I leave." Esther's expression revealed nothing as she placed a plate of eggs and bacon on the table. "Eat first." Difficult. Conversations are better on a full stomach. They ate in charged silence. Through the kitchen window, Thaddeus could see that the storm had done considerable damage. Branches scattered across the yard, the garden partially flooded. It matched his inner landscape, where questions and theories swirled like debris after a hurricane. When they finished eating, Esther led the way outside. "Let's check that repair one more time before you go," she said, clearly trying to postpone the inevitable conversation. The morning air was crisp and clean after the storm. The sky washed a brilliant blue. They walked to the Aston Martin, which sat gleaming and incongruous against the rural backdrop. Esther popped the hood with practiced ease and leaned in to inspect her handiwork from the previous day. Thaddeus watched her hands move confidently among the engine components. The moment felt strangely fragile, as if balanced on the edge of something momentous. "You worked for Horizon Technologies in the 1970s, didn't you?" he asked quietly. Esther's hands paused briefly before continuing their work. "Yes," she admitted. "I was their lead engineer for advanced energy storage systems from 1968 to 1976. Horizon Technologies," Thaddeus repeated. "The company my father acquired to start his empire." Esther straightened up, finally meeting his gaze. "Yes, Maxwell purchased Horizon in 1977, after I was no longer there. Why did you leave?" A shadow crossed her face. Creative differences, you might say. She turned back to the engine. "The bypass is holding well. You should have no problems reaching the city, though I'd still recommend having your mechanic replace the component properly." "Esther," Thaddeus said firmly, Please stop avoiding my questions. Those blueprints in your workshop, they're practically identical to technology my company is developing right now. That's not a coincidence." She closed the hood with finality and wiped her hands on a rag. "No, it's not a coincidence. They were my designs, the foundation for what your company now calls the quantum matrix battery system. But how? Because your father took them when he bought Horizon," she said simply, "along with all my research and patents." The directness of her statement caught Thaddeus off guard. "That's a serious accusation." "It's not an accusation, it's a fact." Her voice remained level, without bitterness. "Maxwell Mercer was a brilliant businessman. He saw the potential in my work when others didn't." Thaddeus struggled to process this information. His father had always been portrayed as a self-made innovator, a pioneer in energy technology. The idea that his empire might have been built on someone else's work, on Esther's work, was difficult to accept. "The ring," he said suddenly. "It was his, wasn't it? That's why it seems familiar. I've seen it in old photographs." Esther's hand went to the ring, twisting it unconsciously. Yes and no. It was originally mine, then his, and now mine again. She looked down at it, a complex mixture of emotions crossing her face. "It's complicated, Thaddeus." "I have time," he insisted. Esther sighed, glancing at the sky as if seeking guidance. "Your father and I were more than colleagues. We were partners in every sense. The ring was a symbol of that partnership, both personal and professional." Something clicked in Thaddeus's mind. "You were lovers," she nodded slowly. "For nearly 5 years, we developed the energy storage technology together. The ring's design, the concentric hexagons, represents the molecular structure we discovered, a perfect lattice for energy containment." As she spoke, Thaddeus felt a strange sensation, as if pieces of a puzzle were finally falling into place. "What happened?" "Life happened," Esther replied. "Choices were made. Maxwell chose a different path, one that didn't include me or the original vision we had for the technology." She looked directly at him now. "He married Eleanor Bishop 3 months after I left Horizon." The timeline struck Thaddeus with sudden force. "That would be just before I was born." Something flickered in Esther's eyes. Pain, perhaps, or resignation. She turned away, focusing on gathering her tools. "Maxwell was ambitious. He saw opportunities I didn't. Our technology could have revolutionized clean energy decades ago, but there was more money in conventional systems." As she leaned over to pick up her toolbox, her sleeve rode up, revealing the scar Thaddeus had noticed yesterday. In the clear morning light, he could see it was more extensive than he'd initially thought. A jagged line running from wrist to elbow, the telltale mark of a serious electrical burn. "You were injured," he observed. "Working on the prototype?" Esther pulled her sleeve down quickly. "An accident in the lab. It happened right before I left." Her voice became tight. "Sometimes creativity comes with a price." Before Thaddeus could respond, Esther suddenly winced, a small cry escaping her lips as she accidentally caught her hand on a sharp edge of the engine. A thin line of blood appeared on her palm. "Here, let me help," Thaddeus said, pulling out his handkerchief and taking her hand to wrap the small cut. As he did, he got a closer look at the ring and froze. Inside the band, barely visible, were engraved initials: MM plus E.C. Maxwell Mercer and Esther Caldwell. His father's ring. On her finger. The implications swirled in his mind like storm clouds gathering once again. "You should go," Esther said quietly, pulling her hand away. The roads will be busy with cleanup crews soon. But Thaddeus couldn't move, couldn't look away from her face. A face that suddenly seemed to hold answers to questions he hadn't even known to ask until now. "Who are you really, Esther?" he whispered. "What were you to my father?" The morning breeze carried the scent of rain-washed earth as they stood in silence, the past and present converging in the space between them, waiting for truth to finally break free after decades of careful burial. "I was his greatest regret," Esther finally said, her voice barely audible above the gentle morning breeze, "and he was mine." She turned away, wrapping her injured hand in Thaddeus's handkerchief. The white cotton slowly bloomed with a small spot of red, like a flower opening in time-lapse. "That's not an answer," Thaddeus pressed, unwilling to let the moment slip away. Esther walked a few paces from the car, stopping to look out over the rain-soaked garden. "What do you want me to say, Thaddeus? That your father and I plan to change the world together? That we almost did?" She touched the ring absently. "That was another lifetime ago." "I want the truth," he said simply. "My entire life, I thought I knew who my father was. A brilliant inventor who built an empire from nothing. Now I discover that the technology my company is built on might have come from you." "Not might have," Esther corrected gently. "Did. But Maxwell improved it, expanded it. He was brilliant in his own right." Thaddeus ran his hands through his hair in frustration. "Why are you defending him? If he stole your work—" "He didn't steal it," she interrupted. "Not technically. When he bought Horizon, he acquired all intellectual property legally. The fact that I no longer worked there when he made those improvements doesn't change that." "But why did you leave? What happened between you?" Esther sighed deeply, her shoulders slumping slightly. "Ideological differences, you could say. I wanted our technology used solely for renewable energy applications. Maxwell saw broader opportunities. Military contracts," Thaddeus guessed, knowing his father's early business strategies. She nodded. "Among other things, we argued. The accident happened." She gestured to her scarred arm. "After that, it seemed best to make a clean break." The simplicity of her explanation felt incomplete, as if she were still holding back crucial pieces of the story. But before Thaddeus could probe further, his phone chimed. Signal had returned. Messages began flooding in, his screen lighting up with missed calls and texts from his executive team. "You should answer those," Esther said, nodding toward the phone. "They'll be worried." Thaddeus glanced at the screen, then back at Esther. The moment was slipping away, and he felt an inexplicable urgency to maintain their connection. "Come visit Zenith," he said suddenly. Esther looked startled. "What?" "Come to my company. See what we've done with your technology." The idea took hold as he spoke, growing from impulse to conviction. "My team is stuck on a problem with the new energy storage system, the cold weather efficiency issue you mentioned yesterday. Maybe you could help." She shook her head. "I left that world a long time ago, Thaddeus." "But you haven't left the work," he countered, gesturing toward her workshop. "You're still designing, still improving. Those blueprints in your workshop have solutions we haven't figured out yet. They're theoretical, untested. Then let's test them." Thaddeus stepped closer, his voice earnest. "Esther, whatever happened between you and my father is in the past. But your work deserves to be recognized, to make the difference you originally intended." Something flickered in her eyes, a brief spark of the passion that must have driven her decades ago. For a moment, Thaddeus thought she might agree. Then she shook her head. "I'm not interested in recognition," she said firmly. I made my peace with anonymity long ago. Then do it for the work itself, Thaddeus persisted. You created something that could help solve the climate crisis. Don't you want to see it realized? Esther turned away, and Thaddeus feared he'd pushed too hard. His phone continued to buzz with incoming messages demanding his attention. The real world was intruding, pulling him back to responsibilities and deadlines. I should go, he said reluctantly, moving toward the driver's door. But think about it, please. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a business card. My direct number. Call me if you change your mind. Esther accepted the card without looking at it, slipping it into her pocket. Drive carefully. The roads might still have debris from the storm. Thaddeus got into the car, feeling strangely reluctant to leave. Through the window, Esther looked smaller somehow, framed against the rural landscape that had been her home for decades. It seemed wrong to drive away, to leave her and her brilliant work hidden away in this remote cottage. Thank you, he said, rolling down the window. For the repair, for the shelter. He hesitated, for telling me about my father, incomplete as it was. Esther nodded, stepping back as he started the engine. It hummed to life perfectly, her repair holding strong. As Thaddeus pulled away, he watched her in the rearview mirror, a solitary figure growing smaller with distance. The ring on her finger, his father's ring, continued to trouble him, raising questions that remained unanswered. Back in the city, he made a call to his assistant from the car. Naomi, I need you to pull all the records we have on Horizon, technologies before my father's acquisition, and find everything you can on an engineer named Esther Caldwell, MIT graduate, 1965. Something told him that understanding Esther's connection to his father was crucial not just to his family history, but to his company's future. The ring, the blueprints, the unspoken history between them, all pieces of a puzzle he was determined to solve. As he navigated back toward the gleaming skyscrapers of the city, Thaddeus couldn't shake the feeling that his accidental encounter with Esther Caldwell was anything but random. For the first time in years, he felt as if he were on the edge of discovering something truly important, a truth that had been waiting for him all along. Zenith Innovations headquarters rose 68 stories above the city, a gleaming tower of glass and steel with the company's distinctive lightning bolt logo illuminated at its peak. Thaddeus barely noticed the stunning architecture as he strode through the lobby, his mind still back at Esther's cottage. Mr. Mercer! Naomi hurried to keep pace with him as he headed for the elevator. His assistant was efficiency personified. Crisp suit, tablet in hand, not a hair out of place despite the early hour. Everyone's been worried. The Bennett meeting had to be rescheduled, and the board— Did you find what I asked for? Thaddeus interrupted, pressing the button for the executive floor. Yes, sir. Everything's waiting in your office. She studied him with barely concealed curiosity. May I ask what happened? You've never missed a board meeting before. Car trouble. Caught in the storm. The elevator doors closed, giving him a momentary reprieve from questions. When they reached the top floor, he headed straight for his office. Hold all my calls, Naomi. I need time to review these files. His corner office offered a panoramic view of the city, but Thaddeus paid it no attention as he settled behind his desk. 3 folders waited for him, one labeled Horizon Technologies, another Esther Caldwell, and a third marked simply Acquisition. He started with Esther's file. It was disappointingly thin. A brief biography noted her graduation from MIT with highest honors, followed by positions at Bell Labs and then Horizon Technologies from 1968 to 1976. There was a copy of a newspaper article showing her receiving an Innovation Award, standing beside a much younger Maxwell Mercer. The two were not touching in the photograph, but Thaddeus noted the way they angled toward each other, like planets caught in mutual orbit. Most interesting was what the file didn't contain. No contact information after 1976, no further employment, records, no patents filed in her name. It was as if Esther Caldwell had simply vanished from the professional world. The Horizon Technologies folder contained more substance: financial reports, technology assessments, market analyses. Founded in 1962, the company had specialized in energy storage solutions, with several promising patents by the early 1970s. Their most innovative project was labeled Project Lattice, an advanced battery technology that, according to one report, could revolutionize energy storage if successfully scaled. Project Lattice's lead engineer, Dr. Esther Caldwell. Thaddeus leafed through technical specifications that were remarkably similar to Zenith's current flagship technology. The foundation was clearly there, though his father had indeed made significant improvements and additions over the years. The acquisition folder told the final chapter of Horizon's story. Maxwell Mercer had purchased the struggling company in 1977 for a fraction of its potential value, acquiring all patents and intellectual property. The timing was suspicious, just months after Esther's departure, when the company was reportedly facing technical setbacks with their main project. One memo, written by Maxwell himself, noted, "Horizon's value lies primarily in Project Lattice, despite recent setbacks following Dr. Caldwell's departure. With proper development and application to defense contracts, the technology could prove extremely profitable." Thaddeus leaned back in his chair, trying to reconcile this calculating businessman with the father he'd known, a man who had taught him about innovation and integrity. Had Maxwell deliberately waited until Esther left before acquiring her? Work at a discount? The thought left him uneasy. "Sir?" Naomi's voice came through the intercom. "Your father's former lawyer is on line 1. Mr. Sullivan says you contacted him yesterday." Thaddeus frowned. He hadn't spoken to Douglas Sullivan in years, not since his father's will had been executed. "Put him through." "Thaddeus." Sullivan's gravelly voice filled the room. "I understand you've been asking questions about Horizon Technologies and Dr. Caldwell?" Thaddeus sat up straighter. "How did you know that?" "I still have friends at your company," Sullivan replied. "Look, son, I respect your father's memory too much to ignore this. Whatever you think you're digging up—" "I met her," Thaddeus interrupted. "Esther Caldwell. Yesterday." Silence stretched for several seconds. "I see," Sullivan finally said, his tone cautious. "And what did Dr. Caldwell tell you?" "Not nearly enough. She wears a ring that belonged to my father. She designed technology that became the foundation of Zenith. And no one ever mentioned her name to me, not once in 42 years." Frustration edged Thaddeus's voice. "What aren't you telling me, Douglas? I'm bound by attorney-client privilege, even after your father's death," Sullivan replied stiffly. "He's been gone for 3 years. Whatever happened between him and Esther was decades ago. What possible harm could the truth do now?" Another long pause. "Some confidences aren't mine to break, Thaddeus. If Dr. Caldwell hasn't shared certain details, perhaps there's good reason." His tone softened slightly. "Your father was a complicated man who made complicated choices. Not all of them are part of the public record, nor should they be." "She thinks he stole her work," Thaddeus pressed. "That's an oversimplification," Sullivan replied sharply. "The acquisition was completely legal. Legal doesn't always mean right." "No," Sullivan conceded. "It doesn't." His sigh carried through the phone line. "Look, I can't discuss specifics, but I'll say this. Your father respected Dr. Caldwell's brilliance immensely. Whatever else happened, that never changed. The conversation yielded little else of substance. After hanging up, Thaddeus sat in frustration, surrounded by fragments of a story he couldn't quite piece together. Something significant was missing. The true nature of Esther and Maxwell's relationship, the real reason for her departure from Horizon, the story behind the ring she now wore. On impulse, he picked up the phone again. "Naomi, cancel my meetings for the rest of the week and have the lab prepare the latest quantum matrix prototype for testing. We're going to have a visitor." "Sir?" "Just do it," he said, standing to look out at the city below. "And find me everything you can about Project Lattice. Technical specifications, test results, everything." He didn't know if Esther would accept his invitation, but he intended to be prepared if she did. The more he learned, the more certain he became that her knowledge was crucial not just to solving their current technical challenges, but to understanding a pivotal chapter in his family's history. As rain began to spatter against the windows, echoing yesterday's storm, Thaddeus made another decision. If Esther wouldn't come to him, he would return to her. Some questions demanded answers, no matter how deeply buried those answers might be. He just hadn't anticipated how personal those answers would prove to be. 2 weeks later, Thaddeus found himself driving the same winding country road back to Millbrook. This time, the weather was clear, the autumn sun casting long afternoon shadows across the landscape. His custom Aston Martin had been properly repaired, but he'd chosen to drive a less ostentatious company SUV, loaded with technical documents and prototype designs. He hadn't called ahead. Part of him feared Esther would refuse to see him, and another part worried about giving her time to hide whatever truth she'd been concealing. The past 2 weeks had been consumed with research, diving deep into the history of Project Lattice and his father's early business dealings. What he'd discovered left him with more questions than answers. The cottage looked different in sunlight, smaller, more ordinary than it had seemed during the storm. Esther's garden had recovered nicely, autumn flowers blooming in neat rows. Thaddeus parked and sat for a moment, rehearsing what he would say. A simple apology for dropping in unannounced seemed insufficient, given the weight of his purpose. Before he could decide, the cottage door opened. Esther stood on the threshold, wearing gardening gloves and a surprised expression. "I heard the car," she said, as Thaddeus approached. "I wasn't expecting visitors." "I should have called," he admitted. "But I wasn't sure you'd agree to see me." She studied him for a moment, her eyes revealing nothing. Then she removed her gloves and stepped aside. "Come in. I just made lemonade." The cottage interior was much as he remembered, though brighter in daylight. Whiskers regarded him with the same suspicious yellow eyes from his perch on the windowsill. As Esther poured lemonade into 2 glasses, Thaddeus noticed her ring caught the sunlight, the geometric pattern seeming to pulse with hidden meaning. "I've been researching Project Lattice," he said, accepting the glass she offered. Esther's expression didn't change. "I suspected you might." The technology was revolutionary, decades ahead of its time. Your time, specifically. He took a sip of lemonade, tart and sweet. "Even now, with all our advanced computing and materials science, we're still catching up to concepts you developed in the 70s. A small smile touched her lips. "The principles of energy storage haven't changed, only our ability to implement them. Sometimes the best ideas come before the technology exists to realize them fully." "That's what I want to talk about," Thaddeus said, reaching for the briefcase he'd brought. "We're stuck on a problem with our latest prototype. The quantum matrix system works brilliantly in moderate temperatures, but efficiency drops dramatically. In cold environments, it's the same issue that plagued the original Project Lattice: He spread technical diagrams across her kitchen table, complex schematics showing energy flow patterns and material compositions. Esther glanced at them with apparent disinterest, but Thaddeus caught the subtle change in her posture, the slight narrowing of her eyes that betrayed her engagement. "My team has tried everything," he continued. "Alternative conductive materials, insulation systems, even redesigning the core architecture. Nothing works without compromising the system's overall capacity." Esther remained silent, but her eyes moved methodically across the diagrams, almost unconsciously. Her fingers touched the ring, tracing its pattern as she studied the technical problems before her. "You know how to solve this," Thaddeus said quietly. "Don't you?" She looked up sharply. "What makes you think that?" "Because you've had 40 years to think about it. Because the blueprints I saw in your workshop showed modifications to the original design that my engineers haven't even considered. Because you're still working on this, aren't you? Even after all this time." Esther walked to the window, her back to him. "Some problems become companions after a while. Hard to let them go unsolved." "Help me," Thaddeus said simply. "Not for recognition or money or anything else. Just for the sake of the work itself. The technology you created could make renewable energy viable in any climate, anywhere on Earth. Isn't that worth putting the past aside?" For a long moment, Esther said nothing. Then she turned and approached the table. With deliberate movements, she picked up a pencil and began making annotations on one of the diagrams. "Your conductive matrix is too rigid," she said, her voice taking on a new authority. "It needs flexibility to accommodate thermal contraction without losing connectivity." She sketched rapidly, adding lines and notations. Here and here. These connection points need to be reinforced with a secondary material that remains conductive at lower temperatures. For the next several hours, they worked side by side, Esther identifying flaws in the design and suggesting modifications while Thaddeus took notes and asked questions. As technical discussion gave way to broader conversation, the tension between them gradually eased. "You should have been recognized for this work," Thaddeus said as they paused for dinner. A simple meal Esther prepared from garden vegetables. "Your name should be on these patents, not buried in old company records." She shrugged, though the casual gesture couldn't quite mask the old pain beneath. "Recognition wasn't what I was after." "What were you after?" Esther looked down at her. "Plate. Change. Real change in how we power our world. Your father and I shared that vision initially." Her voice softened. "Maxwell could see possibilities others couldn't. That's what drew me to him, professionally and personally." Thaddeus sensed an opening. "Tell me about your relationship with him. The real story, not the sanitized version." Esther's fingers found the ring again, twisting it slightly. "We met at an energy conference in 1968. I presented research that most dismissed as theoretical at best, impossible at worst. Maxwell was the only one who saw its potential." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "He offered me a job at Horizon the same day. By the end of the year, we were colleagues. By the following summer, we were more than that." "Even though he was married?" Thaddeus asked carefully. Esther's eyes flashed. "He and Eleanor were separated when we met. Their marriage existed on paper only." She sighed. "Or so he told me. Perhaps I believed what I wanted to believe." "And Project Lattice?" "It became our shared obsession. We worked day and night, testing theories, building prototypes. The ring was Maxwell's idea, custom designed to represent the molecular structure we'd discovered." She held up her hand, the platinum band catching the light. "He had two made, a symbol of our partnership, he said. What we created together. Night had fallen as they talked, and Esther lit oil lamps that cast a warm glow throughout the cottage. The intimate lighting seemed to encourage confidences, memories flowing more freely as evening deepened. "What happened?" Thaddeus asked. "Why did you leave Horizon right when Project Lattice was nearing completion?" Esther's expression darkened. Defense contracts happened, military applications. Maxwell saw opportunities I couldn't accept, using our clean energy technology for weapons systems and surveillance. She rubbed her scarred arm unconsciously. We argued, bitterly. Then there was an accident in the lab, a power surge during testing that could have been prevented. He cut safety corners, Thaddeus guessed. He was pushing too hard, too fast. Esther's voice remained even, but her eyes reflected old pain. After I recovered from the injuries, I found he'd already started negotiating with military contractors. He claimed it was the only way to fund further development. But I knew better. There was money to be made, a lot of it. So you left? I resigned, returned his ring, walked away from everything we'd built together. Her fingers traced the ring that now adorned her hand. I thought that was the end of it. But you're wearing the ring now, Thaddeus observed quietly. Esther nodded slowly. 3 years ago, after Maxwell died, I received a package, the ring and a letter, his final message to me. Her voice caught slightly. Some apologies come too late to make a difference, but they still matter. The revelation hung in the air between them. Thaddeus tried to reconcile this story with the father he'd known, a strict but principled businessman who'd built Zenith on the promise of innovation for the greater good. Had he been trying to atone for earlier choices? Had Esther's influence lingered even after their separation? As the evening grew later, Thaddeus made his final appeal. Come to Zenith. See what we're doing with your technology. Help us solve the cold weather problem, and I'll ensure you receive full credit for your contributions, past and present. Esther studied him thoughtfully. You look like him, you know, the same determination in your eyes. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. One day, to see the lab. Nothing more. It was enough. For now. The following week, Thaddeus waited anxiously in the Zenith Innovations lobby. He'd arranged everything personally. Security clearance, confidentiality agreements, a private elevator to the research floors. Still, he half expected Esther to change her mind. When she finally walked through the revolving doors, he almost didn't recognize her. Gone was the casual gardener in worn clothes. Instead, Esther wore a simple but elegant navy pantsuit with sensible shoes. Her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. She looked every inch the distinguished scientist, carrying herself with quiet dignity that turned heads as she crossed the marble floor. You came, Thaddeus said, unable to hide his relief. I said I would. Esther glanced around the soaring lobby, taking in the massive lightning bolt logo and the quote from Maxwell Mercer etched into the wall. Innovation is the spark that illuminates humanity's future. Her expression revealed nothing. The research labs are on the 15th floor, Thaddeus explained as he guided her to a private elevator. I've assembled a small team, only people I trust completely. They're excited to meet you. Esther raised an eyebrow. What exactly have you told them? About me? That you're a brilliant engineer who worked on the original technology that evolved into our current systems? He hesitated. I didn't mention your personal connection to my father. That seemed private. She nodded appreciatively as the elevator rose. Thank you for that. The research floor was Zenith's beating heart, a vast open space filled with workstations, testing equipment, and prototype models in various stages of development. Thaddeus had cleared one section for their exclusive use, creating a secure area where Esther could work without unnecessary scrutiny. Dr. Maya Santos, Zenith's head of research, waited for them with barely contained excitement. "Dr. Caldwell, it's an honor to meet you," she said, extending her hand. "I've been studying the original Project Lattice documentation. Your approach to energy density was decades ahead of its time." Esther shook her hand, looking slightly uncomfortable, with the deference. "It was theoretical work that needed practical development. I understand you've made significant improvements." "We've tried," Maya admitted, "but we're still struggling with the cold weather efficiency problem. If you'd be willing to look at our latest prototype." She led them to a testing chamber where the newest version of the quantum matrix battery sat. A sleek black cube approximately 2 feet on each side, with diagnostic equipment attached to multiple connection points. It looked deceptively simple, betraying nothing of the revolutionary technology inside. Esther approached it slowly, her eyes narrowing as she examined the external housing. "May I see the interior configuration?" Maya nodded to a technician, who carefully removed the outer casing. Inside, a complex array of cells and circuits formed a three-dimensional lattice pattern that glowed with a faint blue light. "Impressive. Miniaturization," Esther commented, leaning closer. "We could never achieve this kind of density with the materials available in the 70s. For the next hour, she examined the prototype from every angle, asking precise questions about materials, connectivity, and power flow that revealed her intimate understanding of the technology. The Zenith team responded with increasing excitement as they recognized the depth of her expertise. "Let's run a cold test," Esther finally suggested. "I need to see exactly where the efficiency drop occurs." The team carefully moved the prototype into a specialized chamber that could simulate extreme temperatures. As they lowered the environment to -20 degrees Celsius, they watched the monitoring equipment closely. The battery's output remained stable initially, then began to decline precipitously as the temperature dropped further. "Exactly as I suspected," Esther murmured. She turned to Maya. "Do you have microcircuit assembly capabilities here? And graphene-infused conductive material?" "Of course," Maya replied. "Whatever you need." "Good. I need to modify the connection points between the tertiary cells." Esther was already rolling up her sleeves, her earlier hesitation replaced by focused determination. "The problem isn't the energy storage itself, but how the charge transfers between cells when the conductive material contracts in cold environments." She began sketching on a nearby tablet, her fingers moving with surprising dexterity for her age as she outlined modifications to the internal structure. The Zenith team gathered around, watching with growing amazement as Esther quickly identified problems that had stumped them for months. As the day progressed, Thaddeus observed a transformation in Esther. The reserved woman from the cottage was gone, replaced by a confident, commanding engineer in her element. She directed the team with quiet authority, explaining concepts with clarity and patience while deftly making adjustments to the prototype's internal components. During a brief lunch break, Maya pulled Thaddeus aside. "Where did you find her?" she asked in a hushed voice. "She's solving problems in hours that we've been stuck on for years." "It's a long story," Thaddeus replied. "Let's just say she has a unique perspective on the technology." Maya shook her head in wonder. "Some of her solutions aren't in any textbook or research paper I've ever read. It's like she's working from a completely different theoretical framework." "She is," Thaddeus said simply. "It's her framework? The original one?" By late afternoon, They were ready to test the modified prototype. The team gathered around the temperature chamber, anticipation thick in the air as they lowered the environment to -40 degrees Celsius, well beyond the previous failure point. The monitoring equipment showed steady output. No efficiency drop. The battery was performing perfectly. A spontaneous cheer erupted from the team. Maya was beaming, already calculating the implications for their clean energy initiatives in extreme climates. Only Esther remained calm, a small, satisfied smile the only indication of her feelings about the breakthrough. "Remarkable work," Thaddeus said, genuinely impressed. "You've solved in one day what my entire research division couldn't crack in 3 years." Esther shrugged. "I've had decades to think about it. And your team did the hard part, creating the materials and miniaturization that make it viable." As the excited researchers continued to run tests, Thaddeus noticed Esther drift away from the group. She walked slowly around the lab, examining equipment and displays with a wistful expression. When she paused before a wall of portraits, Zenith's Innovators Hall of Fame, Thaddeus joined her. Maxwell Mercer's portrait dominated the center of the display, his confident smile and piercing eyes captured perfectly by the artist. Beside him were images of other key figures in the company's history, but none of Esther. "He built something remarkable from our early work," she said quietly, staring at Maxwell's image. "Whatever else happened between us, I can acknowledge that." Thaddeus noticed she carefully avoided looking directly at his father's face, as though even the painted eyes might see too much. The ring on her finger caught the light as she turned away, creating a momentary prism effect that scattered tiny rainbows across the polished floor. "This has been enlightening," she said, her professional demeanor returning. "But I should go now. I've done what I came to do." Thaddeus felt a sudden reluctance to let her leave, sensing that crucial questions remained unanswered. The breakthrough with the prototype seemed secondary now to the mystery of Esther herself, and what she still wasn't telling him about her history with his father. "At least let me drive you home," Thaddeus offered as they exited the Zenith building. The autumn afternoon was fading into evening, the city coming alive with lights. Esther hesitated, then nodded. "That would be appreciated. The train schedule can be unreliable." The drive to Millbrook was mostly silent, both lost in their own thoughts. As the city gave way to suburbs and then to countryside, Thaddeus knew his window of opportunity was closing. Once Esther returned to her cottage, she might close the door on their connection forever. "I'd like to stop somewhere first," he said, suddenly, taking an exit that would lead them away from Millbrook. "There's someone I think we should visit." Esther gave him a sharp look. "Who?" "My mother." The color drained from Esther's face. "Eleanor?" "No, Thaddeus. That's not appropriate." "She might have answers we both need," he insisted, already merging onto the highway that would take them to Oak Ridge Estates, the upscale retirement community where Eleanor Mercer had lived since Maxwell's death. "Your mother has no reason to speak with me," Esther said, her voice tight. "And I have nothing to say to her." "You don't have to say anything. But I need to understand what happened, and I think she's the only one who can tell me the complete truth." Esther fell silent, staring out the window as suburban landscapes flashed by. Her fingers worked nervously at the ring, turning it round and round. Finally, she sighed. "You're as stubborn as your father was." Thaddeus took that as acquiescence. Oak Ridge Estates resembled a luxury resort, more than a retirement community, with manicured grounds and elegant buildings. Eleanor Mercer occupied a spacious corner apartment in the main building, where she hosted charity committee meetings and bridge games for fellow residents. At 75, Eleanor remained striking, tall and slender with perfectly styled, silver hair, and the impeccable posture of a woman who had spent decades in high society. When she opened the door to find her son standing beside Esther Caldwell, her composure wavered only briefly before social training took over. "Thaddeus, what an unexpected visit," she said, kissing his cheek before turning cool eyes to his companion. "And Dr. Caldwell. It's been a very long time." "Almost 50 years," Esther confirmed quietly. The fact that they recognized each other immediately confirmed Thaddeus's suspicions. Whatever had happened between his father and Esther, his mother had been fully aware of it. Eleanor led them into an elegantly furnished living room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a lake. "May I offer you tea? Or perhaps something stronger?" "This isn't a social call, Mother," Thaddeus said, choosing to stand rather than sit. "I've been learning about Dad's early work with Horizon Technologies, about Project Lattice, about his relationship with Esther." Eleanor's expression remained composed, but her hands betrayed her tension as she smoothed an invisible wrinkle from her silk blouse. "I see." She turned to Esther. "And what prompted this historical research?" "Chance," Esther replied simply. "My car broke down near her cottage during the storm 2 weeks ago," Thaddeus explained. "She helped me fix it. I noticed her ring." He gestured to Esther's hand. "Dad's ring." Eleanor's gaze fixed on the platinum band. Something like pain flickered across her face before she carefully masked it. Maxwell always did have distinctive taste in jewelry. "Mother, please," Thaddeus said, frustration edging his voice. "I'm not here to judge or accuse anyone. I just want the truth. Dad built his company, our family fortune, on technology that Esther helped develop, technology she never received credit for. I need to understand why." Eleanor moved to a small bar cart and poured herself a generous measure of scotch, Maxwell's preferred drink. "The past is rarely as simple as we'd like it to be, Thaddeus. What exactly do you think happened?" "I think Dad and Esther were partners, professionally and personally. I think they developed Project Lattice together, but had a falling out over how the technology would be used. She left Horizon, and Dad acquired the company and all her work shortly after." He glanced at Esther, who sat rigidly on the edge of a chair. "What I don't understand is why he never acknowledged her contributions and why she simply disappeared from the industry." Eleanor took a long sip of her drink, then set the glass down with deliberate care. "Your father was an ambitious man, Thaddeus. When he saw an opportunity, he took it." She turned to face Esther directly. "But he wasn't always proud of the choices he made." "That's not an answer," Thaddeus pressed. Eleanor sighed. "When Maxwell and I separated in 1968, it was meant to be temporary, a cooling-off period as they called it then. While we were apart, he met Esther at that energy conference and became infatuated with her and with her ideas." "It wasn't infatuation," Esther said quietly. "We wanted the same things: clean energy, sustainable technology, a different future." "Perhaps," Eleanor acknowledged, "but when I discovered I was pregnant, priorities shifted. Maxwell returned to his family, as was proper." Thaddeus felt as if the floor had tilted beneath him. "Pregnant? You mean with me?" Eleanor nodded. "You were born in early 1973. By then, Maxwell was fully committed to his family and to building his company. The separation was ancient history. But he continued working with Esther at Horizon," Thaddeus said, struggling to align this timeline with what he knew. "Professional collaboration only," Eleanor said sharply, though her eyes avoided Esther's. Or so I was told. Esther's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, the ring prominent against her pale skin. The work continued. The relationship didn't. Not in the way it had been. Her voice was steady but distant, as if recalling events that had happened to someone else. Maxwell understood his responsibilities. Then, what happened in 1976? Thaddeus asked, "Why did you leave Horizon right when Project Lattice was nearing completion?" A heavy silence filled the room. Eleanor looked at Esther, something unspoken passing between the two women. "The accident in the lab," Esther finally said, touching her scarred arm. "It wasn't just about technical disagreements or military contracts. It was personal." She hesitated, then continued softly. "I was pregnant, Thaddeus, with Maxwell's child." The revelation struck like physical blow. Thaddeus stared at her, then at his mother, whose face had gone carefully blank. "What happened to the child?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "I lost the baby after the accident," Esther said simply. "The doctors said the electrical shock was too severe. After that, there seemed no reason to stay. Maxwell had his family, his company, his vision for the future. I returned his ring and left." Eleanor walked to the window, her back to them both. "Maxwell bought Horizon the following year. He said it was just business. The technology was too valuable to let go." She turned back to face them. "But he kept every notebook, every prototype, every scrap of work that Esther had touched. He stored them in a special archive that only he had access to." "Sentiment or strategy?" Thaddeus wondered aloud. "Both, I expect," Eleanor replied. "Your father was a complicated man." Thaddeus looked between these two women, his mother and the woman who might have been. The full weight of the past seemed to press down on the room. Decades of unspoken truths, finally finding voice. "There's something else you should know," Eleanor said, reaching for a small key on her necklace. "Something Maxwell left for you, Thaddeus. He made me promise to give it to you only if certain circumstances arose." She glanced meaningfully at Esther. "I believe those circumstances have now occurred." Eleanor disappeared into another room, returning moments later with a small wooden box. Its rich mahogany surface gleamed in the soft light. The Mercer family, crest inlaid in silver on the lid. "Your father gave me this before he died," she explained, setting it on the coffee table between them. "He said, if you ever came asking questions about Esther or Project Lattice, I should give it to you." She slid the key from her necklace and held it out. "What you do with the information inside is your choice." Thaddeus accepted the key, aware of both women watching him intently. The small metal object felt unexpectedly heavy in his palm, as if weighted with consequences. He inserted it into the lock and turned it slowly. The mechanism clicked softly. Inside the box lay a leather-bound journal, several yellowed envelopes tied with string, and a small USB drive that looked incongruous among the older items. On top was a handwritten note in his father's distinctive script. "For Thaddeus, the truth I couldn't speak in life." Thaddeus looked up at his mother. "Did you read these?" Eleanor shook her head. Maxwell's privacy was important to him. And some truths— She glanced at Esther. "Some truths are better left between those directly concerned." "I should go," Esther said, rising abruptly. "This is a family matter." "No." Thaddeus's voice was firm. "You're part of this too. Whatever is in here concerns all of us." With careful hands, he lifted the journal from the box. The pages were filled with his father's handwriting, sometimes neat and measured, other times hurried and almost frantic, as if racing to capture thoughts before they escaped. The earliest entry was dated May 1968, shortly after the Energy conference where Maxwell had first met Esther. Her approach to energy storage is revolutionary, Maxwell had written. The scientific community dismisses her as a theoretical dreamer, but I see the practical applications. With the right resources and development, her work could transform how we power everything from household appliances to entire cities. I have offered her a position at Horizon. I suspect this will be the most important decision of my professional life. Thaddeus flipped through the pages, watching as professional admiration evolved into deeper feelings. By late 1969, the entries had taken on a more personal tone. E is unlike anyone I've ever known. Brilliant, yes, but also principled in a way that challenges me daily. She believes technology should serve humanity's highest aspirations, not just generate profit. When I'm with her, I believe it too. Eleanor had moved to the window again, looking out at the gathering darkness. Esther sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the journal in Thaddeus's hands, her expression unreadable. The entries spanning 1970-1972 documented Project Lattice's development, alongside Maxwell's growing internal conflict. His separation from Eleanor had ended with news of her pregnancy, forcing him to make difficult choices. "The child changes everything," he'd written in January 1973, shortly after Thaddeus's birth. "I've recommitted to Eleanor and our marriage, as honor demands. E understands, or says she does. We've agreed to continue our professional collaboration while ending the personal aspects of our relationship. Whether this arrangement can succeed remains to be seen. The work is too important to abandon. But being near her daily while maintaining proper distance feels like a special kind of torture." Thaddeus paused in his reading, glancing up at Esther. Her eyes were closed now, as if in pain or perhaps prayer. Journal entries grew sparser in the mid-1970s, focusing primarily on technical developments and business decisions. Then came a devastating entry from April 1976, "Catastrophe in the lab today. Power surge during testing caused system failure. E was severely injured trying to stabilize the prototype. I should have insisted on better safety protocols, but we were racing against deadlines for the military presentation. She's in hospital now, condition stable but serious. The doctors say she's lost the baby. She was nearly 3 months along. My child. A child I can never acknowledge publicly." "Oh God," Thaddeus whispered, the implications washing over him. He looked up at Esther, whose face had grown pale but composed. "You were carrying his child. After you'd supposedly ended the personal relationship. Supposedly is the operative word," Eleanor said from the window, her voice tight but controlled. Maxwell was never particularly skilled at ending things he cared deeply about. Esther met Thaddeus's gaze directly. It was a moment of weakness for both of us. After a breakthrough with the project. She trailed off, then continued more softly. "We didn't plan for it to happen." Thaddeus turned back to the journal, finding the final entries from 1976. E has resigned from Horizon, effective immediately. She returned the ring and refused to speak with me directly. Her resignation letter cited insurmountable differences regarding the ethical applications of Project Lattice technology. But we both know the true reasons run deeper. Without her, the project has stalled. The team lacks her intuitive understanding of the core principles. I've received word she's purchased a cottage in Millbrook and appears to be withdrawing from the professional world entirely. I find myself at a crossroads. Horizon is struggling financially without Project Lattice's promised military contracts. The technology remains viable but incomplete. I could acquire the company at a fraction of its potential value. securing all patents and research, including E's groundbreaking work. From a business perspective, the decision is obvious. From a moral one, less so. What claim do I have to her intellectual property beyond legal technicalities? Yet if I don't acquire it, someone else will. Someone who may never understand its true potential or honor its original purpose. The final journal entry, dated February 1977, was brief but consequential. The acquisition is complete. Horizon Technologies is now mine, along with all its assets and intellectual property. E's work will not be lost or misused. I've established a separate research division dedicated to civil applications of the technology, though the military contracts will provide necessary funding in the interim. Perhaps someday, when circumstances allow, proper credit can be restored to its rightful originator. Until then, I carry the burden of this decision alone. Thaddeus closed the journal slowly. He took your work, he said to Esther, but he kept it alive, in his own way. At what cost? Esther asked quietly. The military applications we'd argued against became reality. The clean energy vision was relegated to a side project. Initially, yes, Thaddeus acknowledged. But over time, that changed. By the time I joined the company in the early 2000s, Dad had shifted our focus almost entirely to civilian energy applications. The defense contracts were phased out. He looked at her thoughtfully. It's almost as if he'd come back to your original vision. Thaddeus reached for the stack of envelopes in the box. They were addressed to Esther but had never been sent, each one sealed and dated, spanning decades from 1977 to just weeks before Maxwell's death in 2022. Letters he never mailed, Thaddeus said, offering them to Esther. I think they were meant for you. Esther stared at the envelopes, her composure finally cracking as she reached for them with trembling hands. All these years, she whispered. I thought he'd simply moved on. Maxwell never moved on from anything, Eleanor said, with a complexity of emotion in her voice that suggested decades of complicated feelings. Least of all you. The drive back to Millbrook was silent, the weight of revelations pressing down on both occupants of the car. Esther held the bundle of unopened letters in her lap, her fingers occasionally brushing over the faded handwriting. On the envelopes, the USB drive from Maxwell's box sat in Thaddeus's pocket, still unexplored. Darkness had fallen by the time they reached Esther's cottage. Lights from neighboring homes glimmered distantly through the trees, but Esther's place stood in shadow, as secluded as its owner had been all these years. Would you like to come in? She asked as Thaddeus parked. It was the first either had spoken since leaving Eleanor's apartment. He nodded, following her up the garden path. Inside, Esther moved through familiar motions, lighting lamps, putting on the kettle, welcoming whiskers as he wound around her ankles. The domestic routine seemed at odds with the emotional upheaval of the day. When they were settled at the kitchen table, mugs of tea steaming between them, Thaddeus finally spoke. Why didn't you tell me the whole truth from the beginning? About the child? About how things really ended with my father? Esther's hands wrapped around her mug, drawing warmth from it. Some pain never truly becomes past tense, Thaddeus, even after 47 years. She looked up at him, her eyes clear and direct. And what would telling you have accomplished? Maxwell made his choices. I made mine. The past can't be changed. But understanding it changes the present, Thaddeus countered. My entire life, I've believed in my father's vision, his integrity. Now I learn that Zenith Innovations was built on technology he essentially appropriated from you after a personal relationship ended badly. It wasn't theft in the legal sense, Esther said, echoing her earlier words. The acquisition was legitimate. Legitimacy and justice aren't always the same thing. Thaddeus ran a hand through his hair, a gesture unconsciously mirroring his father's habit. Dad cultivated this image of a self-made innovator, but his greatest breakthrough came from your work. Work he never publicly acknowledged. Your father was a brilliant businessman who saw potential others missed, Esther replied. That's a kind of genius, too. Without his resources and determination, Project Lattice might have remained theoretical forever. Thaddeus studied her with growing frustration. Why are you defending him? After everything he did? Because life isn't a morality play with heroes and villains, Thaddeus. Esther's voice took on an edge. Maxwell was neither saint nor monster. He was human, brilliant, flawed, ambitious, sometimes selfish, sometimes remarkably generous. She gestured around the cottage. Do you think I could afford this place on a researcher's pension? The property was purchased through a trust he established anonymously. I didn't discover his involvement until years later. This revelation caught Thaddeus by surprise. He provided for you, while maintaining public distance? His way of making amends, perhaps. Esther touched the ring on her finger. Just as this was, in the end. Thaddeus pulled out the USB drive from his pocket, turning it slowly between his fingers. I need to know what's on this. Will you look with me? Esther hesitated, then nodded. I keep a laptop in the workshop. The workshop looked different in the lamplight, less a secretive archive and more the active workspace of a mind still engaged with problems that had occupied it for decades. Esther powered up an older but serviceable laptop, and Thaddeus inserted the drive. It contained a single video file dated just weeks before Maxwell's death. With a deep breath, Thaddeus clicked play. Maxwell Mercer appeared on screen, clearly, ill but still commanding even in his weakened state. His once dark hair had gone completely white, his face lined with age and illness, but his eyes remained sharp and intelligent. He sat in what appeared to be his home office, books and engineering awards visible in the background. Thaddeus, he began, his voice raspier than in life, but still strong. If you're watching this, then you've discovered the connection between Esther Caldwell and our family's legacy. I had hoped to explain everything myself, but time hasn't been as generous as I'd hoped. Maxwell shifted in his chair, gathering strength for what was clearly a difficult confession. The technology that built Zenith, that created our family's fortune and reputation, began with Esther's brilliance. We were partners in every sense, until circumstances forced difficult choices. When she left Horizon, I saw an opportunity to acquire her work legally, if not entirely ethically. He paused, looking directly into the camera as if trying to connect across time with his son. I justified it as necessary. The technology was too important to languish, and only I had the resources to develop it properly. But the truth is, simpler and less noble. I couldn't bear to let her work, the tangible evidence of our collaboration, fall into other hands. It felt like losing her twice. Maxwell coughed, taking a moment to recover before continuing. Over the years, I tried to honor the original vision we shared, gradually shifting the company away from military applications toward the clean energy solutions Esther had championed. It was my attempt at redemption, I suppose. Too little, too late. He glanced down at something off-camera. The ring, Thaddeus realized, the match to the one Esther now wore. I've written Esther countless letters I never had the courage to send. Explanations, apologies, updates on how her technology has evolved. The final one, along with this ring, will reach her after I'm gone. Cowardly, perhaps, to wait until death. Makes confrontation impossible. Maxwell looked up again, his expression softening. Thaddeus, you've led Zenith with more integrity than I managed in my early years. Now I'm entrusting you with the truth, and with a choice. Esther deserves recognition for her contributions. How and whether to provide that recognition is now your decision. I trust you to find a better balance of business and ethics than I achieved. The video ended with Maxwell reaching forward, his hand briefly filling the screen before it went dark. Silence filled the workshop as the implications of Maxwell's confession settled around them. Thaddeus looked at Esther, who sat very still, her eyes fixed on the now blank screen. He knew, she said finally. All those years, I thought he'd simply moved on, built his empire, forgotten our work together. But he knew. The final letter, Thaddeus said. The one he actually sent with the ring. What did it say? Esther's fingers went to the ring, twisting it gently. That he was sorry. That the technology had finally come full circle, returning to its original purpose. That in the end, I had been right about its proper application. She swallowed hard. And that he had never stopped loving me, despite all his failures to show it. The simplicity of the confession hung in the air between them. Thaddeus looked around the workshop, at the decades of continued work represented in Esther's blueprints and prototypes, then back at the woman herself, brilliant, principled, resilient in the face of profound loss and disappointment. I need to make this right, he said, his decision crystallizing. Zenith needs to acknowledge your contribution, not just privately, but publicly. The quantum matrix battery should bear your name alongside my father's. For the first time since he'd known her, Esther Caldwell looked truly surprised. 6 months later, Thaddeus stood at a podium in Zenith Innovation's grand atrium, surrounded by journalists, industry leaders, and employees. Behind him, a large screen displayed the company's newest achievement, the Caldwell-Mercer Energy System, a revolutionary battery technology that maintained optimal efficiency in environments ranging from desert heat to Arctic cold. Today marks not just a technological breakthrough, Thaddeus announced to the assembled crowd, but the correction of a historical oversight. The foundation of Zenith's success was built on the brilliant work of Dr. Esther Caldwell, whose contributions have gone unrecognized for too long. Cameras flashed as Esther rose from her seat in the front row. At 78, she stood tall and dignified in a simple blue suit, her silver hair arranged elegantly. The geometric ring gleamed on her finger as she joined Thaddeus at the podium. Dr. Caldwell's original work on Project Lattice in the 1970s established principles that were decades ahead of their time, Thaddeus continued. Today, we honor her vision by establishing the Esther Caldwell Fellowship for Women in Engineering, supporting the next generation of innovators who, like her, see beyond conventional limitations. Applause filled the atrium. Maya Santos and her research team beamed from their seats, having worked closely with Esther over the past months to perfect the technology. The public announcement followed weeks of legal work to ensure Esther received both recognition and appropriate financial compensation for her intellectual contributions. After the ceremony, as attendees mingled during the reception, Thaddeus noticed Esther standing alone by a large window, looking out at the city skyline. Having second thoughts? He asked, joining her. She shook her head. Just reflecting on the circuitous paths life takes. 50 years ago, I dreamed of seeing this. Technology used to transform energy access worldwide. Today, it's finally happening. She turned to face him. "Your father would be proud of what you've done." "What we've done," Thaddeus corrected. "The fellowship is already receiving applications from brilliant young women engineers. Your story has inspired them." Esther smiled, a genuine expression that softened the years on her face. It's strange to be visible again after decades of solitude, but not unwelcome. The past 6 months had transformed both their lives. For Thaddeus, the key revelation of his family's complicated history had initially shaken his confidence in everything he thought he knew. But as he worked with Esther to bring her innovations to light, he found a new sense of purpose and integrity in righting past wrongs while honoring his father's later attempts at redemption. For Esther, emergence from self-imposed isolation had been gradual but profound. She'd begun consulting regularly with Zenith's research division, mentoring young engineers, and finally receiving long-overdue recognition within the scientific community. Though she maintained her cottage in Millbrook as a sanctuary, she no longer retreated from the world and its possibilities. "I have something for you," Thaddeus said, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small box and handed it to her. Esther opened it carefully to reveal a platinum ring identical to the one she wore, but sized for a larger hand. "Your father's," she said, recognizing it immediately. "Yes," Thaddeus confirmed. "Mother gave it to me after he died, but it never felt right to wear it until now, until I understood its full significance." Esther lifted the ring, examining the geometric pattern that represented the molecular structure she and Maxwell had discovered together. "The perfect lattice," she murmured. "I thought we might display them together at the company museum," Thaddeus suggested. "The paired rings that symbolize the partnership behind our foundational technology." "No," Esther said, surprising him. "You should wear it." She held it out to him. "Continue the legacy, but with the full truth acknowledged." Thaddeus accepted the ring, slipping it onto his right hand. It fit perfectly, as if made for him. Perhaps, in some way, it had been a connection across generations linking the original vision with its future manifestation. "There's something else I've been meaning to ask you," he said, guiding her to a quieter corner away from the crowd. "In all our conversations about the past, about you and my father, something still doesn't quite add up." Esther raised an eyebrow. "What's that? When we first met, when my car broke down, you seemed to recognize me immediately, even before you saw my ID or knew my name, and you knew exactly how to fix that specific model of car, as if you were prepared for my arrival." A mysterious smile touched Esther's lips. "Perhaps some coincidences are more deliberate than they appear." Thaddeus stared at her. "You knew I would be driving that road?" "Let's just say I keep track of certain things," she replied, "including the movements of Maxwell Mercer's son, who happens to drive through Millbrook on the 3rd Friday of each month to visit his upstate manufacturing facility. And the storm? My car breaking down precisely where you could find me?" Esther laughed softly. "The storm was genuine fortune, or misfortune, depending on perspective. But that particular electrical failure in your vehicle's system?" She shrugged, slightly. "Some flaws can be anticipated by those who understand the underlying engineering." Thaddeus was momentarily speechless as the implications settled. "You engineered our meeting. All this time, I thought it was chance. I'd waited decades, Thaddeus. After receiving Maxwell's final letter and the ring, I needed to know if his words were true, if the company had truly returned to our original vision, if his son was the man he claimed." Her eyes held his steadily. "Sometimes fate needs a bit gentle nudge. Why not just contact me directly? Would you have truly listened?" Or would I have seemed like just another claimant to your father's legacy? She touched the ring on her finger. Some truths need to be discovered rather than told. Thaddeus shook his head in amazement. You're as strategic as he was. We were well matched, she acknowledged with a small smile. In more ways than one. From across the room, a photographer called for them, wanting a picture of the historic partnership for the company archives. As they moved to join the others, Thaddeus noticed a photograph on a nearby display panel, one recently added to the company's historical timeline. It showed a young Esther and Maxwell standing together beside an early prototype, both wearing the distinctive rings, their expressions captured in a moment of shared triumph. The past and present had finally aligned, the full circle of their intertwined history, now visible for all to see. As Thaddeus stood beside Esther for the photograph, their matched rings catching the light, he felt a sense of completion that transcended the technological breakthrough they were celebrating. Some journeys took decades to reach their proper destination. Some broken circuits needed time before they could be properly repaired. And sometimes, an old woman helping a millionaire fix his broken car was exactly where a story needed to begin, for long-buried truths to finally emerge into the light. Where are you listening from today? We'd love to know in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Every subscription helps us spread more kindness and heartwarming stories like this one. Don't miss our next emotional journey. Click on the video appearing on your screen right now to continue being inspired. Remember, sharing these stories helps remind others that connections can be found in the most unexpected places. Until next time, keep believing in second chances and the power of truth.